May 1st, 1960. High above the Ural Mountains, at a staggering 70,000 feet, Francis Gary Powers felt like a ghost. In his U-2 spy plane, he was convinced he was in the dead zone, a sanctuary where Soviet interceptors couldn't breathe and guns couldn't reach. It was the perfect, silent arrogance of the Cold War. But deep in the forests near Sverdlovsk, something heavy, jagged, and terrifyingly new had just locked on. Powers had no idea what an S-75 Divina was. He didn't know that the untouchable era of American aviation was about to end in a ball of fire. In 10 seconds, his silence would shatter, and the two most powerful nations on Earth would hurtle toward the brink of World War III. But that silence over the Urals wasn't some accident of fate. It took 15 years, 2 continents worth of wreckage, and a very precise failure of imagination to build it. Walk back to 1944. The best anti-aircraft gun in the world, Germany's 88mm Flak 36, required roughly 3,000 shells to statistically guarantee a single kill against a high-altitude bomber. The American 90mm M3 wasn't better. These weren't flawed weapons. They were mathematically overwhelmed. A jet aircraft at 40,000 feet, moving at 500 miles per hour, didn't leave a gun crew enough time to calculate, rotate, elevate, and fire before the geometry collapsed. Both superpowers walked out of 1945 carrying the same cold conclusion. The barrel was finished as a serious air defense tool. The Americans arrived first. Bell Laboratories had been running Project Nike since February 1945. The math worked before the war even ended, and in 1954, the MIM-3 Nike Ajax became the world's first operational surface-to-air missile. Batteries ringed Washington, New York, Chicago. Missiles sat in underground silos on hydraulic lifts, raised to the surface before launch. In winter, those lifts froze. The propellant, red fuming nitric acid mixed with dimethylhydrazine, was corrosive enough that fueling crews wore full chemical gear for routine procedures. On April 14, 1955, at Fort Meade, a booster ignited without command during a training drill. The missile left its launcher. The fuel tank came apart over a highway. A sergeant standing 7 feet away took the flash across his face and called it a good day because he could still walk. Nike Ajax had a deeper problem than its propellant. It was single channel. 1 radar track, 1 missile, 1 target. Against a Soviet bomber regiment flying in tight formation, exactly the scenario it was built to stop. The tracking radar saw a smeared blur and couldn't separate one aircraft from another. ARIDCOM's answer was overlapping battery rings, coordinated by telephone. It worked on paper. Everyone involved knew it barely worked anywhere else. The Soviets built something technically more ambitious. Their S-25 Berkut, operational around Moscow by 1955, deployed 56 firing sites in 2 rings, each capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously. On paper, it outperformed anything the Americans had fielded. It was also permanently fixed. Every position required a concrete foundation, dedicated power infrastructure, and a full-time crew. The construction around Moscow took years and consumed resources most countries couldn't match for their entire defense budget. Moving it was not an option. Scaling it across the full Soviet perimeter was economically impossible. The S-25 protected 1 city. The threat would never be limited to 1 city. 2 systems, 2 superpowers, 2 different engineering philosophies, both circling the same unsolved question. Not whether a missile could hit a bomber, whether it could hit that bomber, the one already airborne, already at altitude, already over terrain no one had thought to cover. The Urals. May 1st, 1960. 5 years after both systems went on alert, the answer arrived. And it didn't come from the system anyone had bet on. The S-75 Divina existed because the S-25 had proven one thing clearly: concrete doesn't scale. A system that required years of construction and couldn't relocate wasn't a shield. It was a monument. The S-75 was the correction. Mobile, transportable by rail or road, deployable in hours. Its V-750 missile used radio command guidance, a liquid-fuel two-stage booster, and a ceiling just high enough to reach aircraft that had been considered untouchable. By 1957, S-75 batteries were quietly positioning themselves along the exact corridors American U-2 aircraft were flying. That detail matters. The Soviets weren't guessing. They had tracked the routes, calculated the geometry, and placed their systems where they needed to be. The Americans kept flying. They believed altitude was a sanctuary. May 1st, 1960, the 57th Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade outside Sverdlovsk fired 3 missiles at Powers U-2. The first missed. The second detonated close enough to destroy the tail assembly. The third, by some Soviet accounts, may have struck a Sukhoi Su-9 interceptor, scrambled to the same coordinates, without ammunition, ordered to ram if it had to. The pilot survived. Powers survived. Everything else ended. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and total. The Paris summit, Eisenhower and Khrushchev, May 16th, collapsed before it started. Washington denied the flight, then couldn't. Powers was alive. The wreckage was on public display in Moscow. 1 battery, 1 radar lock, 1 decision in a forest outside Sverdlovsk, and the most carefully constructed diplomatic moment of the decade was gone. The American response wasn't a better aircraft. It was already decided. Nike Hercules, equipped with a W-31 nuclear warhead. The logic was direct. If a conventional warhead couldn't guarantee a kill against a tight Soviet bomber formation, give it a blast radius large enough to make precision irrelevant. Up to 40 kilotons. Positioned around American cities, the warhead protecting the population and the warhead threatening it were the same warhead. Nobody said this out loud. Then Cuba. October 1962. 24 S-75 divisions on the island, and on the 27th, Rudolph Anderson's U-2 gone. The only combat launch of the entire crisis. But the real point wasn't the kill. It was the closure. S-75 had sealed the airspace over Cuba for medium and high altitude reconnaissance, not through diplomacy, through a ready missile and a crew that knew exactly what it was doing. 3 years later, the same system would arrive in Vietnam and meet, for the first time, an adversary that had studied every one of these moments and built something specifically designed to end them. Vietnam did something no testing range ever could. It ran the S-75 continuously against an adversary that adapted in real time, under conditions the system was never designed to survive. April 1965. The first batteries arrive in the north. Within weeks, Soviet technical advisors are already revising their estimates. The reliability figures measured outside Moscow, stable temperature, clean power, prepared ground, don't translate. Tropical humidity corrodes connectors in days. The soil in the delta won't hold launcher footings level. Generators overheat on continuous duty. The system works, but the gap between specifications and reality is wide enough to matter. July 24th, 1965. First combat launch. An F-4C Phantom disappears from radar. The Americans learned something important. There is now a threat at the altitudes where guns don't reach, and where pilots felt, until today, like they had time to think. Washington's response came in layers. The fastest was Wild Weasel. F-100Fs and later F-105Fs, fitted with passive radar homing receivers, and the AGM-45 Shrike, a missile that tracked the S-75's guidance radar emission directly back to its source. The logic was surgical. The moment a battery switched on its fan-song radar to engage, it also painted a return address. Turn the radar on, get a Shrike. Turn it off, lose the target. Choose. The Vietnamese crews chose a third option. Minimum radar on time before launch. Passive tracking using jamming signals as a reference. Nightly relocation of entire battery positions. Some divisions moved every 24 hours. Decoys appeared on abandoned sites. Bamboo frames painted to look like missiles and transport vehicles from 2,000 feet. In July 1965, during Operation Spring High, 48 F-105s hit those positions. 6 American aircraft were destroyed. by conventional anti-aircraft guns protecting the fake sites. The S-75 batteries were already somewhere else. By the end of the war, 7,658 missiles had been fired. The Vietnamese side claimed 1,046 aircraft destroyed. That's roughly 7.3 missiles per kill. Soviet pre-war specifications estimated 1.5 to 2. The difference between 1.8 and 7.3 is not a malfunction. It is electronic countermeasures, pilot maneuver, Shrike pressure, crew quality, and the particular difficulty of fighting in a war where the enemy has 6 months of your after-action reports before you change tactics. No Cold War defense planner could ignore that number after 1972. It became the figure that every subsequent SAM program had to answer. And in the background, NATO staff officers were absorbing every lesson quietly. The S-75 in Vietnam was the same system sitting in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. The wild weasel answer that worked over Hanoi, partially, expensively, with acceptable losses, would not scale to the Central European theater. The density was different. The terrain was different. The threat was already evolving into something the Shrike couldn't chase. That something had a new radar band, a self-propelled launcher, and a name the Israelis would learn to say clearly in October 1973. October 6, 1973. Israeli pilots had flown against Arab air defenses before and come home. In 1967, they had destroyed 4 air forces on the ground in one morning. The muscle memory of that week had calcified into doctrine. If the radars go up, you hit them first, you hit them fast, and you own the sky by noon. The sky over the Sinai on day 1 of the Yom Kippur War didn't follow that script. Egypt and Syria hadn't just acquired new missiles. They had built a new architecture. SA-2 covered medium and high altitude. SA-3 Neva. Operational since 1961, combat proven in the War of Attrition over Egypt's Canal Zone in 1969 and 1970, closed the low-altitude band the S-75 couldn't reach. And between those layers, moving with the armor columns across the desert floor, was something the Israelis had no electronic answer for: the 2 K-12 Kub, known to NATO as the SA-6 Gainful. The SA-6 was self-propelled on a tracked chassis, 3 missiles per launcher. The straight flush guidance radar operated in a centimeter waveband, different from the decimeter frequencies of the SA-2 and SA-3. Israeli F-4s and A-4s carried warning receivers optimized for threats studied in Vietnam. The SA-6 didn't register until the missile was already in the air. Pilots reported it the same way, repeatedly, in debrief after debrief. No warning tone, no spike on the scope, just impact. In the first 72 hours, Israel lost 50 aircraft. In the entire 6-day war of 1967, the total loss had been 46. 6 years of technological progress had produced that inversion. On day 3, Israeli command decided to repeat 1967. Operation Tagar, a mass strike on the SAM positions. The SA-6 batteries had already moved. 6 F-4 Phantoms were shot down attacking coordinates where the launchers had been hours earlier. General Peled halted the operation. The post-war Israeli Air Force assessment was careful with its language, but clear in its conclusion. The doctrine that had produced 1967 was no longer valid. There was a secondary finding that took longer to surface. A CIA analysis of the war noted that Israeli aircraft loss rates per flying hour were actually lower in 1973 than in 1967, because Israeli pilots adapted faster than anyone expected. The layered Arab air defense had not destroyed Israeli air power. It had displaced it. Aircraft survived by maneuvering so aggressively that bombing accuracy dropped below the threshold of useful. Tanks on the ground kept moving. The bridges stayed up. That distinction mattered enormously. The SA-6 hadn't won by killing. It had won by disrupting, by forcing every attacking pilot into a defensive geometry that left no attention for the actual target below. It was a different kind of effectiveness, and it required a different kind of answer. In Pentagon briefing rooms that autumn, the question wasn't academic. The same SA-6 batteries were positioned across the Central European theater in numbers that made the Sinai look sparse. The wild weasel that worked in Vietnam was a partial answer against SA-2. Against SA-6, at the density of a Warsaw Pact front line, it was not an answer at all. The system that would eventually provide one was already in development. It had been in development, under various names and revised requirements, since 1961. It would take another 11 years to reach a field unit. But the war in the Sinai had just made sure the money would keep coming. After October 1973, NATO entered something that looked like a program review, but felt like an emergency. The math was simple and uncomfortable. If the Sinai had that density of layered air defense, the Central European theater had more batteries, shorter engagement corridors, terrain that funneled aircraft into kill zones with no alternative routing. The improved Hawk program accelerated. Engineers revisited the AN/MPQ 46 illumination radar to harden it against jamming, extended the engagement envelope against maneuvering targets, and pushed a new seeker that could handle the ECM environment the Vietnam generation had not anticipated. Good work, necessary work, roughly a decade too late for the threat it was chasing. The longer answer was Patriot. The program had started in 1961 under the name SAM-D, a replacement for Nike Hercules that would handle the next generation of Soviet aircraft and, eventually, ballistic missiles. By 1973, it had already changed its requirements twice, cycled through multiple contractors, and consumed a budget that would have funded several smaller programs entirely. What was being built was genuinely new, a phased array radar that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously, a digital command post, vertical launch capability in later variants. The engineering was sound. The timeline was not. Production contract in 1980, operational readiness in 1984. 23 years from concept to fielded system. While Patriot was being finished, the answer to the 1973 question came from a different direction entirely. June 9, 1982, the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. Israel launched Operation Mole Cricket 19 against Syrian air defense positions. The same SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 architecture that had cost them 50 aircraft 9 years earlier. The result in 2 hours, 29 of 30 Syrian SAM batteries destroyed. Between 82 and 86 Syrian aircraft shot down in the subsequent air battle. Israeli losses, minimal. The method was systematic. Unmanned drones flew into the Syrian radar coverage first, triggering emissions that were immediately logged by E-2C Hawkeye aircraft orbiting outside the engagement zone. A GM-45 Shrike and the newer AGM-78 standard ARM followed the emissions back to their sources. ECM aircraft suppressed what wasn't destroyed. F-15S and F-16S handled the fighter response. No single element of this was new. Wild Weasel had used pieces of it over Hanoi. What was new was the orchestration. Every component timed, every emitter cataloged, every escape route for the SAM crews anticipated and closed. For Moscow, Bekaa 82 confirmed what the after-action reports from Vietnam had implied. SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6, without mobility discipline and without mutual support, were now targets before they were threats. The deployment tempo of S-300 batteries inside the Soviet Union accelerated visibly in the following 18 months. The S-300 was a different problem for SEAD entirely. Phased array, simultaneous multi-target engagement, 5-minute deployment time, vertical launch with no dead sector. Nobody had run Mole Cricket against it. Nobody would, not before the geopolitical context that required it began, quietly, to dissolve. In West Germany, Patriot batteries stood their first alert in 1985. Nike Hercules stood next to them for several more years. Older, slower, still technically functional, watching the sky for a threat that the diplomats were already beginning to negotiate away. The S-300 never fought the war it was built for. That is not a technical failure. It is something stranger. a system that arrived at the exact moment its adversary began to disappear. By the mid-1980s, S-300P batteries were replacing S-75 and S-125 positions across the Soviet Union at a steady pace. The engineering represented a genuine generational break, a phased array radar that didn't rotate mechanically, but steered its beam electronically, tracking up to 6 targets simultaneously and guiding missiles against several of them at once. Vertical cold launch ejected the missile straight up before the motor ignited, eliminating the dead sector that every previous system carried on its flanks. Deployment time under 5 minutes. On paper, it was the answer to Baka-82, a system that could move before the drones found it and engage before the Shrikes arrived. The B-52s and F-111s it was designed to stop never came. The Fulda Gap never opened. Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty in December 1987. The wall came down in November 1989. By 1991, the Warsaw Pact existed only on paper, and the Soviet Union itself had months left. Patriot had its test, but not the one anyone planned. January 1991, Saudi Arabia and Israel. Incoming Scud missiles, modified Iraqi variants with degraded accuracy and structural instability that caused some to tumble and break up in terminal descent. Patriot PAC-1 had been designed against aircraft and cruise missiles. Against ballistic warheads arriving at Mach 5, its guidance software interpreted a tumbling Scud as multiple targets or no target at all. The official assessment after the Gulf War was carefully worded. Independent analyses were less careful. One battery near Dhahran failed to engage a Scud that killed 28 American soldiers. The system that took 23 years to build was being asked, in its first combat deployment, to solve a problem its designers had listed as a future upgrade. Nike Hercules came off alert in the United States between 1974 and 1988, and in NATO allied nations through the early 1990s. The crews who decommissioned those batteries had served in systems that never fired a live round in anger. Some had been on continuous alert for 15 years. Their entire operational existence had been the deterrent, the reason the phone never rang. You cannot measure that contribution in kill ratios. You also cannot explain it easily to a crew sergeant standing in a concrete silo in Bavaria in 1988, signing off on the final equipment inventory. The systems dispersed. SA-6 and SA-3 batteries moved into the conflicts of the 1990s under new flags: Bosnia, Iraq, Yugoslavia. In March 1999, a Serbian SA-3 battery, commanded by Colonel Zoltan Dani, shut down its radar at irregular intervals, fired without standard acquisition procedure, and shot down an F-117 Nighthawk over Serbia. The aircraft that was supposed to be invisible to every radar built before the digital age came down in a field outside Bujanovci. Dani later said the key was patience and unpredictability, qualities no specification document ever quantified. The last Nike Ajax had gone to a museum. The last S-75 in active Soviet service was being replaced by something faster. But somewhere in a Serbian field, a crew with a 40-year-old system and a different way of thinking had just reminded everyone that the technology was never the whole answer. It never had been. 30 years of engineering, thousands of missiles, 2 superpowers who spent more on defending their skies than most nations spent on everything else combined. And the final lesson wasn't written by a general or an engineer. It was written by a Serbian colonel with a notebook full of timing patterns and a crew that knew when not to turn the radar on. Every system in this video, Nike Ajax, S-75, SA-6, Patriot, S-300, was built to answer a specific threat at a specific moment. Every single one was obsolete before it was finished. Every single one still found a way to matter. That tension between what a weapon was designed to do and what war actually asked of it is the real story of Cold War air defense. And honestly, it never stopped being the story. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you. This took a long time to put together, and videos like this only happen when the people watching them tell the algorithm they're worth making. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. Not because of a notification bell, because there's more coming. The next one goes deeper into systems that never made it to deployment, programs that were canceled months before they would have changed everything. The stuff that didn't happen is sometimes more interesting than the stuff that did. If you have corrections, additions, or you served on any of the systems mentioned here, the comments are open. Some of the best details in this script came from people who were actually there. See you in the next one.